You're listening to the Ecocide Report, a monthly podcast from Stop Ecocide International and the Movement for Ecocide Law. Stop Ecocide International is working tirelessly to get ecocide recognised by the International Criminal Court, but we need your help. If you value this content or want to support the work of Stop Ecocide International, you can become a patron over at patreon.com for just 1 hour's wage per month. Your support makes our work possible, and we can't thank you enough.
So, for those who are new to this, Jojo, could you talk a bit more detail about what Stop Ecocide International is doing right now, not just as a raison d'etre, but the steps it's actually taking, what's happening now and what's coming next?
I can indeed. Our core of our work is the global development of kind of cross-sector support to criminalise mass harm to nature, or ecocide. I mean, the etymology of ecocide is killing one's home. I mean, it's a very apt way to describe what's happening to our planet. And so our work, we consider ourselves to be an advocacy organisation, but we're also at the heart of what is now a growing global movement. And so, we deal with, we encourage mobilisation at grassroots, but we also, we brief and give information at NGO and corporate level, but also at political level, informing, convening, and we have lawyers that we work with, but we also work with people in faith groups, with Indigenous voices, with diplomats. So, we're really across the board growing a conversation, I would say, effectively, so that we can start to envisage globally the framing that we need. In other words, what is it that we need to avoid doing? What is the harm that we need to stop? What is the damage that we need to prevent and protect from in order to move forward into a world that is harmonious, that works with nature, and that actually gives our children something to look forward to? This has been just the most incredibly busy month, and it's involved New York Climate Week and the UN General Assembly. It's involved participation in the online Virtual Island Summit. It's involved inclusion in a really important report on business and the launch of a business open letter. It's included an amazing amplification by the youth movement around this work to criminalise ecocide. So yeah, it's been a really exciting month.
That's outstanding. So let's start with New York Climate Week. How did that go?
Well, New York Climate Week is just an incredible moment during the year. It takes place at the same time as the key session of the UN General Assembly, and all the key voices from states and also from the world of environment and climate are in New York during that week. So it's an incredibly key moment in the year. And we were out there with a small team. I had diplomatic meetings out there with various ambassadors, and we also took part in events during the Climate Week. And perhaps the most exciting moments it's worth highlighting that emerged out of that time. During the UN General Assembly, for the first time, a head of state called on the UN members to support those states that are proposing to go forward with making ecocide the fifth crime at the International Criminal Court, and that was President Nike Vurobaravu of Vanuatu. And so that was really very exciting for us to have that spoken out in the UN General Assembly.
Well, I think that's really exciting. What do you think it says about where the movement is at now, where it's reached and where it's going next?
I think that shows that we're moving beyond the specific forums that we've been speaking in up until now, and obviously the very key one is the International Criminal Court itself, but this is the first time that an official statement from a state has put it in front of the UN General Assembly, and that really shows that the conversation is reaching the UN level, not just in that assembly but across other conferences and so on, to the extent that the president of Vanuatu felt comfortable doing that, and that is a really significant moment.
So this sounds pivotal, but let's examine how could this request, this speech, this broadcast during the UN General Assembly itself, how could this affect the process you're going through with the ICC?
I think the key aspect of it is it gives it a level of seriousness, of urgency, and of weight. Because the ICC is not a direct UN body, and it's but it is made up in a similar way of, not the same number of states, but it has a similar structure of one state, one vote, and so on. But it's also the case that this initiative to make ecocide a criminal offence at the international level is something that many states have still not engaged with. And of course, they're all present for the UN General Assembly. So it's a way of kind of bringing it onto the radar of a number of players who also, of course, have a seat, have a representation at the ICC. And therefore, it's a kind of it's an amplifier of the conversation. It's a bringing it onto the radar for those states.
That's excellent. Did the leader of Vanuatu during the assembly point to specific steps they were hoping member states could take? Did they make requests of the assembly that were pointed, or was it a broad general request and call to action?
It was a broad and general request, and it came as part of a range, because Vanuatu is really positioning itself as a climate leader, particularly in the arena of following legal avenues and unusual, innovative ways to move forward the action that is needed to address climate and ecological breakdown using the law. And so Vanuatu mentioned several legal avenues, and ecocide is a key one of those.
Interesting. So in terms of focusing on Vanuatu and their specific circumstances, are there elements of ecocide law that apply to them specifically, or were they making a broader request for the law as it applies internationally?
I think as it applies internationally, because what they're really trying to call people into is a position of taking responsibility. And this is something that I think we're seeing across the most climate vulnerable states. They're really wanting the rest of the world, and especially the wealthy North, to take responsibility for the current situation. And of course, ecocide is a root cause of climate and ecological crisis. Even if we stopped all emissions tomorrow, if we continue to strip forests, to pollute the oceans, to ruin ecosystems, which are also the key vital carbon sinks, we will still have a climate crisis. And there's a recognition of that in the support for this preventive legal measure. And I think that's really the sort of positioning that Vanuatu has on this.
So thank you for that. Thank you for talking about the exciting new news at UNGA. But in terms of New York Climate Week generally, were there any other high points that you want to mention?
Absolutely. There were some other key moments, and one was the emergence of a demand for ecocide law as one of the key demands put forward by youth activists at the climate march on the Friday of New York Climate Week, which is the 23rd, and there were a number of other marches happening around the world. But the New York one strongly focused around 4 key demands, of which ecocide law was one, and that was a real key moment for amplification, and I think it also showed a kind of new understanding within the youth movement of how important this law will be in protecting their future.
Absolutely. No, it's I think it's a new level of awareness, not just when you get official, I hate to use the word, but it is correct, bureaucratic acceptance of the importance. And there's a process that's there, but I think it's a new level of acceptance when those kinds of legal, structured, administrative processes are backed by the involvement of actual people and activists and people on the street calling for change. Are there highlights within that you wanted to talk about?
What was wonderful was some of our team were involved in that march, and particularly we have a fantastic youth co-lead for Youth for Ecocide Law, who's from Sweden, and she was over for that march and was just absolutely animated it with her incredible spirit and way of talking to everybody about what we're doing. And some of the speeches at the rally also addressed ecocide law, including one from the chair of our US allies, Julia Jackson, who's also working really closely with the youth activists over there. So yeah, it was a really inspiring moment during the week.
That's excellent. So just to rounding off New York Climate Week, you had this amazing win at UNGA. You were involved with activists who literally took the message to the streets to try and call in older members of the public or a more diverse crowd into the conversation. But are there any other issues that came up or any pointers you want to make about that week?
There definitely is, and it's another really key place that this conversation is emerging. And this was as part of a report called the Pivot Point Report. Now, this report was brought out by the Race to Zero. It's a group of climate champions, high-level climate champions around the world, representing all different industries, who have been really diving into how to galvanise, up till now, voluntary action around climate. And this report actually was ultimately an acknowledgement that voluntary action on climate is not enough. It's not moving fast enough. And I think this echoes a kind of frustration that we can feel all around the world, and we can feel it at every level. It's at grassroots level, it's with NGOs, it's with corporates, it's with policymakers, and it's even at the UN level. This frustration that the agreements that are in place are not triggering enough action on the ground to actually meet the level of the crisis that we're facing. And this report was an acknowledgement in that Race to Zero context that we need to move beyond voluntary contributions, beyond voluntary insights and actions, to regulation, to policy, to a new kind of set of ground rules for the economy, if you like, that will actually help to steer action in the right direction. And they had a whole chapter in that report on the drivers and influences of change. And there was a whole section there on ecocide law as a driver and influencer of change. And that is a really important place for that conversation to start being opened up, because of course it is the actions that are being taken by corporations in the economic world that are ultimately need to start flowing in a new direction. And that was a really really exciting development, actually. Money is like water. It just flows wherever it's allowed to flow. So that's where the framing comes in as really important. And sometimes it can just be about stimulating the right questions. I mean, I have great faith in human imagination, human ability to come up with solutions that can take us in the right direction, so solutions that are innovative, that work in harmony with nature. But if we're not asking the right questions, it's hard to find those answers. And there's nothing like a set of parameters for having people ask the right questions. In each sector, they can be saying, okay, well, if this is how ecocide is defined, how is that going to apply to my sector?
So let's talk in a little bit more detail about the virtual island summit that you attended as well. I'm really keen to find out more about the stresses and strains of balancing the economic pressures that these islands face with the environmental goals that they have. I mean, this is virtually universal around the world. Because I think it's a false dichotomy. I think that it's wrong to ask people to choose between, their money or their lives, frankly. Did you see evidence of that happening within that context?
And I think this is particularly the case with the Ecocide Law route, is how island states can take control of the agenda in some way, and by moving forward something where a one state, one vote forum is at play, and at the International Criminal Court, unlike at the UN, there isn't a veto. So it is about bringing in the numbers. Actually makes a huge difference in terms of numbers of states, even if they're, economically speaking, smaller players. And so I think that was a really interesting and useful juxtaposition, and useful to kind of create, to provide that information in that forum. And that attracted considerable diplomatic interest. So Vanuatu co-sponsored those events and contributed to them. But we also had, for example, the ambassador from Antigua and Barbuda, the ambassador to the US, who's a very strong supporter of what we're doing. And it was a very kind of, high-level conversation, but one that is really fascinating to land in that context, to give, to sort of show what tools are available.
That's excellent. I think there's another really interesting paradox, if you like, that comes out of these conversations. I think sometimes people ignore, because we tend to sort of define these things as sort of good versus evil, right versus wrong, and these things are never as clear. We all know this, because there will be island states, for example, who may want to explore their own oil and gas reserves or undersea mining opportunities near them. And then there'll be others, screaming on the sidelines going, please do not do this. because the broader context of this is very challenging. Have there been conversations between yourselves and other potential partner organizations, like, for example, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Group?
It's interesting you bring up the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty, because that's another of the legal avenues that Vanuatu is pursuing and that is also of interest to a number of countries. And I think this, I think it's, as you say, it's not fair on those countries to create this kind of either-or relationship, because ultimately there are other ways to go, and actually what the wealthy North should be doing is supporting those states in moving beyond the oil and gas pathway that has been so destructive. We know that other technologies and better approaches are already available, so it's a question of how is that facilitated. And again, I think there is this frustration amongst those countries that the support that is coming from the North is not enough, and it's not focused in the right places. And so I think this plays into what's coming up next for us, which is we're going to be at COP27 in Egypt. And there's inevitably going to be a big conversation around loss and damage, which has been a disappointing one, I think, for many people so far, because there has not been the support forthcoming that there should have been. And what's interesting is that, this is the first time that the Ecocide Law Initiative is actually being presented at COP as part of the official programme. So there's actually an event that focuses around Ecocide law as part of the official side event programme. And I think that the relationship there is very much, certainly for us, it's around identifying the frustration at the lack of action, the frustration at the lack of financial support, and the looking to the legal framing to potentially start channeling action in the right direction. And that's going to, I think, be a really interesting context for us to arrive at COP27 in. And we're having, we'll have stand space there. We'll actually have a really strong presence there. And that's the first time that's been an official part of the climate COP. So I think that's a really interesting juxtaposition.
So within the context of understanding the signposting that these new laws create in our region, in Europe, and the Middle East and Africa, but specifically the European Union, I think there was some discussion about the new European Crime Directive and the impact of how that overlapped with the work you're doing, how you made that more effective or amplified certain sections of it. Did you want to talk about that?
Absolutely, because that is something that is an ongoing discussion in the EU. As you say, there is this directive. It was originally the 2008 directive on protection of the environment through criminal law, and it's open for revision at the moment. And there is a revision draft being discussed and going through various committees and so on. And there's quite a strong push from civil society, but also from some of the EU agencies. A few months ago, the Economic and Social Committee, suggested that ecocide should be included in that revised directive, and that's a major opportunity. It's one that we're certainly pushing for, and it's one that the European petition organisation We Move, which is like the Europe version of Avaz that you may have heard of, they've taken up the sort of campaigning baton on this recently and put out a petition to asking whether people would want to support this going into the EU Crime Directive, and there are already over 70,000 signatures on that petition. So that's a really it's a really obvious sort of show of support for that moving forward, and we've also created a position paper around it, which has well over 100 organisations have already endorsed it, and that number is growing all the time. So this is a kind of opportunity, I suppose, for the EU to take some leadership in this area, because when it comes down to it, it is our approach to the economy, to overconsumption, to all of these things that are kind of have been built into our way of doing things for the last few decades. that have put, the more vulnerable countries in the positions that they're in. And so, having some kind of, moral leadership and legal leadership emerge out of this, I think would be an appropriate response from the EU. And it's certainly one that we're seeing the conversation growing around, and the next few months we'll see this hopefully develop to the point where it actually gets adopted into the directive.
That's excellent. I think 70,000 signatories is no small thing at all. Is there a call to action that you'd like to make around this issue? Because I think certainly within the context of the process that directives go through at the European Commission, there are lots of stages, and there are lots of different parties who are interested, lots of committees who review it. Is there a call to action you'd like to make for partnership or specific people or groups within the EU?
Yeah, I mean, very, very simply, for civil society, we would encourage you to obviously sign this petition. If you look up We Move Ecocide petition, you'll find it, and you'll also find it linked to on our website. And for organisations, we would really encourage you to look at the full position paper that the Stop Ecocide Foundation has produced, and you can find that on our website under Act Now. You'll see the European directive, and to endorse that, because it's actually very powerful when organisations get together and collaborate and endorse something. And actually, Frans Timmermans last year was quoted as saying that he believed that ecocide would soon be understood with the same urgency as the climate crisis is understood, and at the time his thinking was that perhaps that call is not yet loud enough. Well, I think we're already disproving that. We're already showing that actually the momentum is gathering at a pace that shows it really is of concern to citizens. And a survey that was done earlier this year actually showed this, that well over half of people who came across ecocide for the first time instantly thought this needs to happen, and that's actually and that's before they've even sort of got into discussions around it. Of course, that number goes up, but it shows that there is a moment to seize here, and absolutely we would encourage people to endorse that and to talk to their own MEPs, to encourage them to support, and that vote will probably come in January, but also potentially their ministers for justice, ministers for the environment. This is where, of course, those two meet.
So in terms of important calls to action, one of the newer things that you're doing is you're writing an open letter to business, as in calling business in to join, if you like, Business for Ecocide Law. Could you talk in a bit more detail about it, what you're hoping to achieve from it, what steps you're taking now and plan to take in the near future?
Absolutely. So the open letter for businesses to sign is aimed at governments. So it's aimed from business at governments to call on them to support an international crime of ecocide. And it's framed around primarily, the first point and the obvious one for everyone, of course, is protection of the earth, protection of the planet for our children. But it's also looking at, why would business get behind this? It's about stabilising of risk. It's about levelling of playing fields. It's about creative constraints, stimulating innovation, all of those things. So it's a real opportunity for businesses, great and small, all around the world, to potentially, put pen to paper and say, yes, we want this to happen because this needs to happen. And that can then be presented at big conferences like, the COP27 of the climate COP, like December's COP15 of the Convention on Biological Diversity, all of these kinds of forums. And it's really important because it helps the government decision makers to feel safe. Ultimately, politicians never come to the party till everyone's there having a good time already. They need to feel safe and they're going to look good. So, a lot of that involves business support. Effectively, businesses great and small are what keep all of our lives moving.
I think that if we're going to end on a high, we should say that knowing that you've managed to receive 70,000 signatures in support of your action with the European Crime Directive is so, for me, so heartening. And if that's just the beginning, I can't wait to see where you go next.
You've been listening to the Ecoside Report. You can find out more about all of the issues discussed in this episode via the links in the podcast description. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next time.